Hello, Preet. Can you hear me? Okay, so let me share the screen with you and let's get started. So let me tell you a little bit what we'll do today and then move forward from there. So in today's class, we'll talk about, right, so far what we have covered in labor market, right? So labor market is quite of an extensive topic, as I told you earlier. And this is also very important from exam point of view because often you see a question related to labor market, essay questions in the exam, right? So that's why we are spending more time and we are going in detail and we are, covering every aspect of it. Okay. Now, what is labor market, right? The idea is fairly simple and easy. So just like there are markets for other products, right? Like product market, where there is demand and supply for different products that are bought and sold. In labor market, it is the labor services that are bought and sold. So who provides labor services? It's basically the suppliers, the individuals, right? So supply of labor is determined by the people who are willing to work for different companies, right? The workers basically. And then you have um, demand for workers, right? Which is basically determined by the companies who are willing to hire labor, right? So demand and supply of labor. Okay. Now, this being said, then we looked in quite a lot of detail. What is demand for labor? So demand for labor is basically its marginal revenue product of labor, right? So demand for labor curve is basically labor marginal revenue product of labor. And what is that? So that is how much additional revenue each labor generates for the company. That is marginal revenue product of labor, right? So if you remember, we looked at the labor demand curve on the y-axis, we had marginal revenue product of labor, right? So on the y-axis, you will have MRPL, marginal revenue product of labor, which is basically additional revenue that each unit of labor is generating. And on the x-axis, you will have quantity of labor. Now, due to diminishing marginal product of labor. Now, what is diminishing marginal product of labor? Diminishing marginal product of labor says that each additional unit of labor will produce less output. Each additional unit of labor will produce less output. Therefore, your labor demand curve will be downward sloping. So your labor demand curve will be downward sloping. Why? Because each additional unit of labor is generating less, is producing less units of output, right? And we did talk about this in a lot of detail that if you remember that example, that there's a restaurant and you keep hiring more cooks, then what will that do? That will um, make each additional cook uh, produce less food or less output, right? So that is the reason why. And I mean, that's just one example, right? Similarly, you can use apply the same case in different businesses to know reasons why the marginal product of labor is always diminishing, right? So as you hire more quantity of labor, right? So as you move from one labor to two labor, and then from 2 to 3 people, right? So you can see that each additional unit of labor is generating less output, right? So that's why your demand for labor curve will be down sloping. The demand for labor curve will be down sloping. Good on this, students? Is everything clear? Okay, now moving forward, we also talked about supply of labor. And who determines supply? Supply is determined by individuals who are willing to work, right? So that is basically, and within supply of labor, we talked about two supply curves. So we talked about individual labor supply, which is basically of one person. And then we talked about the market supply of labor, right? So market comprises of all the individuals who are willing to work in a certain occupation, right? So if you think of individual labor supply, that was simple, where we looked at that how many hours will someone be willing to work at different wage rates, right? So if I get a certain wage rate, then how many hours would I want to work? That was individual. That's only one person. So that is individual labor supply, right? But if you think about um, market labor supply, so market labor supply is market labor supply comprises of all the people who are part of that occupation or profession, right? Uh, Market labor supply, right? So that is upward sloping graph, and that shows at different wage rates how many people will be willing to work. So I'm talking about market. Now I'm talking about market labor supply, right? So what that actually shows is you have wages on the y-axis and you have quantity of labor on the x-axis, right? Or number of people So the higher the wage rates you earn, higher the wage rates that you earn, um, more the number of people will be willing to work in that occupation, right? So just to quickly show you, and then we are coming to the main part of today's topic, right? So if let's say the wage rate in the market is W1, then this many people will be willing to work, right? So let's say Q1 quantity of 500 people will be willing to work um, at wage rate W1, right? So let's label this point as well. So let's say this is point A, and then if your wage rates are any higher than this, right? So let's say you're operating now on point B, right? So at higher wage rate, obviously, there will be greater number of people who are willing to work, right? Now, where the market demand and market supply of labor intersect, that is the equilibrium point in the labor market. We did talk about this, right? So where the market demand for labor for a certain occupation, right, intersect with the market supply of labor, right? That is where the labor market equilibrium is. Okay, now think about this. Let's look at the labor market equilibrium and then we will talk about wage differential. Okay, now think about this. In fact, we can do wage differential along with labor market equilibrium. Okay, now you have wages on the y-axis. Now this is something that you have to listen to carefully. So you have wages on the y-axis and you have quantity of people or quantity of labor on the x-axis of the graph. Okay. Now this being said, now let's compare two occupations, right? So we are about to see that why different occupations, why different professions earn different wages, right? So in the last class, as far as I remember, we compared the wages or the salaries that managers earn compared to receptionists, right? So let's stick to that example and let's do a quick recap. Okay, now if you think of any company, that could be a school, that could be an hospital, that could be a big multinational company, anything, right? So if we compare the salaries or the wages that managers will earn in that company compared to, let's say the people who are working as a receptionist, right? Then why is there a wage differential between these two occupations or these two professions? That's what we're about to make on this graph. Okay, now let's talk about first of all the demand for the two occupations, right? So if I'm making these two demand curves, right? If I'm making these two demand curves, now Preet, can you tell me that which of these two demand curve will be for the manager and which of these two will be for the receptionist? And if I can also know the reason for that. So out of the orange, right? Out of the orange and the purple demand curve, which one do you think would be for the orange for manager? Exactly. Very good. Excellent. And what's the reason? So this demand curve, this orange one will be for the managers, which is higher than the demand curve for the, I'm using this notation so that we can differentiate, right? So DM means demand for managers and DR means demand for receptionists. Okay. Now, simply knowing the fact that marginal revenue product of labor is any occupation's demand curve, right? So we just have to ask ourselves, which of the two occupations generate more revenue for the company? Which of the two occupations generate more revenue for the company? And that is the occupation whose demand curve will be higher, right? So what is marginal revenue product of labor? So change in revenue due to change in quantity of labor. So as you hire more people in the company, how much will be the increase in revenue? That's what it is. Now, we did talk about this in the last class as well, that managers have more skill set. They are looking after, they have more responsibilities. They are looking after major issues, major aspects of the business. Therefore, they are more likely to generate more revenue. For the same quantity of labor, more wages are to be paid to managers in comparison to receptionists. Yeah, that's another way to put it. Right. That's correct, Preet, what you have written. But again, the idea is that the revenue that managers can generate for the company is much higher than what a receptionist would generate. And therefore, what you have written is then the second part of it, right? That if a person is more valuable, valuable in terms of what? In terms of revenue, right? So if an employee is more revenue valuable for a company, because of the revenue that that person generates, then obviously the company would be willing to pay higher wages, right? Does it make sense? So, right? So for any quantity of workers, let's say Q1 quantity, for receptionist, how much wages is this company willing to pay to receptionist, right? This much, right? This much. Just a second, right? So this would be the wage for this much quantity of a receptionist that the company would be willing to pay to receptionist. But if you compare this with how much wage the company would be willing to pay to managers, you can see for yourself that the wages that the company is willing to pay to managers is much higher compared to the wage that you're willing to pay to receptionists, right? Does it make sense? Is this clear? Are we good? Can we move on? Okay, now that was about the demand side. Now let's move on and also talk about the supply side, right? Now looking at the supply, very nice, right? So let me make two supply curves, right? So there is this one supply curve, right? Which is, let's say, like this. And then you have another supply curve that's like this, right? Now, which of the two occupations will have greater supply? Preet? Which of the two occupations would have greater supply? And if I can also know the reason for that, right? Right? Okay, so the supply of the occupation, supply will be more for the occupation, which is easier to join, right? Now think about this. Becoming a receptionist doesn't require a lot of skill. You just need to have some basic, what is that called? Basic communication skills. You just need to do some basic data entry and things like that, right? Right, exactly. And therefore you don't need very specialized education to become a receptionist, right? Even a high school graduate can do that, and so on, right? But for becoming a manager, you need very specialized education. You need to have, you know, good understanding of how businesses operate, and all that stuff, right? Accounting, finance, marketing. So these are all the things that a business manager is usually expected to know. So that being said, less people will be qualified enough to become a managers, and given the experience it requires and all that stuff. So supply of managers is expected to be lower than the supply of receptionists. Now where the demand for managers and supply of managers intersect, so that will be the equilibrium in the managers market, right? So this is the equilibrium point in the managers market, where a typical manager will be paid a wage W, and this much quantity of managers will be hired in the market, right? So quantity QM. On the other hand, where the supply of receptionist and demand for receptionist intersect, that will be the equilibrium in the receptionist market. And you can see for yourself that at this equilibrium point, this much quantity, at this equilibrium point, this much quantity of receptionists will be hired, and this much will be the, this much is the quantity, and this much is the wage rate that they get, right? So overall, there might be more receptionists, right? Because obviously you need more people to be at the front desk or stuff like that, right? So less quantity of managers are there in the market, but their wages are higher than what receptionists earn, right? Easy, we good on this. So that was the wage differential. Now moving on, we'll build on this. Now we are about to look at types of labor market. Now, this is something very important, and we are moving close towards completing this topic, but this is again a very important topic within labor market. Types of labor market. Now, think about this. Types of labor market. Now, either a labor market is perfect. What perfect labor market means, that is what I'll explain you in a bit, right? Or a labor market can be imperfect, right? Now, knowing the understanding of the market structures that we covered before this topic, right? We used a term, one of the market structures that we studied in the previous topic was perfect competition, right? So I'm just giving you a hint to kind of relate to that. So just like there is a perfect competition market in the products market, there is kind of similar thing happening in the labor market, which we call perfect labor market, right? So think about this. In this, we'll talk about two types of labor markets. One is perfect labor market. What is that about? We'll talk about it. And the other one is imperfect labor market. Why is the other one imperfect? We'll also look at this later. Okay. Now, to give you some background before we dive deep into these two things, right? Imperfect labor market. Now, as far as the perfect labor market is concerned, right? There will be few assumptions, right? There are few things, few characteristics that hold true, right? And obviously those characteristics and those assumptions or those things will not hold true in imperfect labor market. So perfect means, I mean, that is an ideal situation. That is what perfect means, that if this situation exists, that is ideal, that is good, that should happen, right? So that is what perfect labor market is about. Okay, now think about this. The first thing that you need to know, that in perfect labor market, there are a lot of companies that are willing to hire people, and there is a huge supply of individuals who are willing to work, right? So there are a couple of firms who are willing to hire labor, and there is large supply of workers who are willing to work, right, in the market, right? So the first characteristic of perfect labor market, Huda, so we are doing perfect and imperfect labor market, right? So we have just started a new topic, building on our previous lectures, knowledge and understanding. Okay, now in perfect labor market, let me write it down on my notes, because that way it would be easier instead of doing it over here. Just a second. Can you see my screen over here, right? Okay, now let's talk about labor. So as I said, within labor markets, you will see two types. One is perfect labor market, one is imperfect. Now coming to the first, perfect labor market. Okay, there are some assumptions, as I was saying, that there are some assumptions that need to hold true for a market to be defined as perfect labor market, right? Now the first one is, many companies owns, right, in market to hire people, and huge supply of workers who are willing. So think about this on both sides of the market. So first thing that you need to know, that in perfect labor market, there will be a lot of demand for labor, and who is generating that demand for labor? Obviously the companies or the firms who want to hire the people to get the work done. And there's also a huge supply of labor coming from the individuals who are willing to work, right? Okay, and that is the first characteristic that needs to hold true. Second is, workers have homogeneous skill set. Now, this is something that's very, very important. So we need to understand this. What does homogeneous skill set mean? Homogeneous means similar, identical, right? You know that. So workers have more or less similar skill set. So it's not that some people are very qualified or some people are too much skilled, whereas other people are not that skilled, and so on, right? So in perfect labor market, we expect that workers will have more or less similar skill set, right? Okay. Then another thing that we know through perfect competition, another thing that we studied in perfect competition, and that is also applicable in this case, firms are wage takers. Does that ring any bell? Firms are wage takers. So whatever wage is prevailing in the market, workers will sell at that wage. Firms will hire workers at that wage rate. So just like in perfect competition, firms were price taker, which meant that whatever price is prevailing in the market, at that price, one individual firm can sell its products. Similarly, in labor market, whatever wage rate is determined in the market based on market demand for labor and market supply of labor, you as an individual firm have to hire at that wage rate, because if not, then no worker, like especially if you're paying less, then why would anyone want to work for your company? Are you getting? So think about it. There's mega lecture, there would be other schools, there would be other online teaching platforms. So if mega lecture is offering less compensation compared to other similar companies, then why would any teacher or why would any person want to work with mega lecture? And right, are you getting? So that is what it means, that firms are wage takers. They hire workers at the prevailing market wage rate, at the prevailing market wage rate, right? And then another very important characteristics: workers have complete information about of jobs and conditions slash salaries, right? Another thing, workers have complete information. So there's no information gap. There is no information, as we say, asymmetry, right? So it's not that workers don't know what, workers do not know. Workers do know. Workers do know that what are all the different jobs available where they can apply, what type of working conditions can they expect when they apply to a certain job, how much salaries they can expect to earn when they're working with different companies and stuff like that. So workers have complete information, right? And the last, right, but yet very important characteristics, workers have geographical and occupational mobility. Okay, now let's discuss this one. What is geographical, right? So geographical obviously means, right, place, a certain region, a certain place, right? So think about this. India is a big country. Pakistan is also relatively a big country, right? So when we say that workers have geographical mobility, that means that someone living in, otherwise a resident of Islamabad, if that person finds a job in Karachi or Lahore, that person can move to that other city. Similarly, if in case of India, there's a resident of Delhi, but he or she found a job in, let's say, Bangalore or Mumbai, right? Then that person can go and work in that other city, right? So there's geographical mobility. You can move around in different cities, right? And obviously to some extent on international level as well. But the problem with international mobility is that you need a work visa. In India, no Indian needs a work visa to move from one city to another city. You know that, right? Similarly, in Pakistan, you don't need a work visa as long as you're within the borders of Pakistan. But if any Indian or if any Pakistani wants to work in another country outside their own countries, then they need a work visa. So that just creates a little complications. But it's not that you don't have international mobility, you also have international mobility, but obviously within the country it's much easier. Okay, now what it means to have occupational mobility. Occupational mobility is very important. Think about this. It means that people can switch between occupations. So it's not that if someone has studied, let's say, to some extent, that would not be the case. So think about this. Occupational mobility means that if someone is a teacher, then that person can also go on to becoming a manager of any company. Similarly, if a person is otherwise a lawyer, that person can go on to becoming, let's say, a teacher at some place or things like that. So you can switch between occupations. A nurse can go on to becoming an air hostess and stuff like that, right? Are you getting me? So that is what it is. Now, obviously, we know that not all of these characteristics hold true in every market. I repeat myself, not all of these characteristics hold true in every market. And therefore, those markets are not perfect labor market and those are imperfect labor market. I'll give you a couple of examples after this, but very last characteristic, there are no external wages. Have you guys heard of trade unions, government intervention, and right? So for now, let's restrict to these two. Okay, now think about this. So let's quickly discuss the sixth one, and then I'll give you an overall overview again, and then move forward. Okay, now there are no external influences on wages like trade unions, involvement, government intervention, etc. Okay. Now, what is trade union? You would know, especially if you have studied economics before, trade union is a group of workers who represent workers at workplace, a group that is made up of whose members are basically workers themselves, employees, and they have formed this platform or an organization, whatever you want to call it, to advocate for workers' right. So they will go on and negotiate salaries with the company. They will go on to negotiate about the working conditions that workers are working in and things like that, right? So that's what trade union. It's kind of a pressure group. It's kind of a pressure group which creates pressure for the companies to improve the salaries and to improve the working conditions for their members. Now, government intervention, obviously, we know can happen in different ways. Like government often imposes restrictions like minimum wage, right? And government also do other stuff like making sure that workers are protected, right? So their rights are not infringed. That's the thing. Okay. Now, students, let's do a quick recap of what we have studied so far and then move forward, right? Think about this. So I said within labor market where labor services are bought and sold, that is what a labor market is. There could be two types: perfect labor market, imperfect labor market. What is perfect labor market, right? So perfect labor market resembles perfect competition. Perfect labor market resembles perfect competition, right? The only difference is that perfect competition is in product market where products are bought and sold, and perfect labor market is obviously within the labor market. Okay. Now, what are the characteristics that need to hold true for a labor market to be defined as perfect labor market? Okay. Now, the first one, there are a couple of firms, many firms, in fact, would be a better word. Many firms or companies available in the market to hire people and huge supply of workers who are willing to work, right? So normally for any country, in most cases, you will see that this thing holds true, right? That there are a couple of firms who are willing to, of different nature, right? That are willing to hire workers, and there's a huge supply of workers who are willing to work. Then workers have homogeneous skill set. So the skill set that workers possess, as I said, is similar, right? It's similar. It's not that some people are way qualified and other people not qualified at all. So they have kind of similar skill set. Then firms are wage takers. Now, what that means, you'll see in a bit that whatever wage is prevailing in the market, after this, we'll look at the graph, and that is where you'll get this point cleared more. Firms are wage takers. Whatever wage is prevailing in the market based on market force of demand and supply, any individual firm will hire its workers at that wage rate. Got it? Okay. Now, workers have complete information. So there's no information asymmetry. Information asymmetry means that when one group has more information compared to the other group, right? So that is information asymmetry. So in this case, we are assuming that in perfect labor market, workers have complete information about the nature of the job, the working condition, the salaries, and things like that. Workers have geographical and occupational mobility. They can move from one place, one city, one area, one region to another region, and they can also switch between occupations, right? As I gave you some examples. Okay, and there are no external influences on wages like trade unions, government intervention in form of minimum wages, and things like that. Okay, now if this is clear, first of all, tell me, is this clear? Is this clear? Or Preet? Right. Okay, perfect. So let's, if this is good, then we will look at the graph. Okay, now have a look at this. Now I'm about to make two graphs in front of you, right? So one would be for the industry or the market, and the other one will be for the individual firm. Now think about this. Okay, now let's talk about, since Mega Lecture, or is an online teaching platform. So let's talk about what happens in the case of teachers, right? Now think about this. So you have wages. So this graph on the left is for the industry or the market, right? Let's write down the word market, right? So this is showing us what's happening in the market for teachers, right? And then on the left side, I'll show you for the individual firm. Okay, now you have wages on the y-axis right? And you have quantity of labor on the x-axis, wages on the y-axis, and quantity of labor that will be hired in the market on the x-axis, right? And now on the other graph, on this right graph, again, you will have wages on the y-axis and quantity of labor on the x-axis. But the only difference is that on this graph, we are showing it for an individual firm, not for the entire market, but for one firm, right? So I'll write down the firm over here, right? Okay, now this is for a single firm. Okay, now think about this. Now, first, looking at the market side, think about it. What is the demand? What is the total demand for labor in the market that will be represented by demand for labor curve, right? What is the total demand for teachers in, let's say, Pakistan? Because Pakistan, right, as we said, that teachers can move from one city to another. So now we're not saying that what is the demand for teachers in Islamabad or what is the demand for teachers in Karachi. We are saying that what is the demand for teachers across Pakistan, right? Because labor is mobile, right? Labor can move from one place to another. Okay. Now, that demand for teachers in Pakistan will be represented by the demand curve for labor, right? So I will say MD. I'll write this down and label this as MD, market demand for teachers, right? Okay. Now that demand curve, this demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, is showing the total demand for teachers in Pakistan, which basically comprises of what? Which comprises of the schools that want to hire teachers, obviously. But nowadays, it also includes the online teaching platforms, right? Online teaching platforms are also a thing. So it also includes that because online teaching schools also hire teachers, and so does conventional schools, right? Good. Okay. Now, how many people are available in the market? Sorry, how many people are available in the market to work as teachers, who are qualified enough to work as teachers? That will be shown through the market supply of teachers. That will be shown through market supply of teachers. Are we good? Okay. Now, where the demand and supply of this occupation, intersect, that will be the equilibrium point in the market, and that will show us the wages, right? That will show us the equilibrium wage, that how much a typical teacher will earn in Pakistan, and it will show us the total quantity of teachers that will be demanded in Pakistan, let's say per year or so on, right? So let's say per year, 5 million teachers are hired in Pakistan, right? So y-axis is showing us a certain wage rate that could be 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, whatever per month, right? So a typical teacher in Pakistan earns this much, and the quantity of total number of teachers in the market in the entire of Pakistan will be 5 million. Is this making sense? Is this clear so far? Okay. Now, Preet, think about this. Now, what would it look like? Now, we have talked about the market. We have talked about the entire country. We've talked about the market. But now we are moving to discuss what happens in the case of a firm. Now, Mega Lecture is one firm, right? Mega Lecture is one online teaching platform that operates in Pakistan, right? And we also demand teachers because obviously we can't operate without teachers. So we demand teachers, right? So what happens in our case? That's what I'm about to explain you. Okay, now think about this. So our demand for teachers would also look like this. Our demand for teachers, the graph for teachers demand at Mega Lecture, right, would also look like this. But the only difference is that it's only our demand, right? Mega Lecture's demand for teachers. It's not the total market demand, right? Because in market, there are other schools, there are other online teaching platforms and things like that. Okay. Now, what you have to do, you have to extend the wage rate line from the left graph to the right graph. You have to extend the wage rate line from the left graph to the right graph, right? And then I'll draw a straight horizontal line like this, right? Why am I doing that? I'll explain you. Okay. Now, this is the wage rate at which we can hire labor. Why so? Because think about this. I did explain you that if we pay our teachers anything less than this wage, so whatever this is, 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 rupees, whatever, right, per month. So if we pay our teachers anything less than that, they will not be interested in working with us because they have other options available and they can move. Exactly. Very right, Preet. So it's just like the perfect competition, right? So what it shows that this horizontal line is the benchmark. So if you want to pay anything more to your employees, that's great. You can technically do that, right? But you cannot pay them anything less, because otherwise they will not join mega lecture, but they'll go and work for our competitors, they'll go and work for schools, blah blah blah, right? So at least we have to pay this. And obviously, why would any company want to pay workers more than that? So if you can hire them at a lower cost, why would you want to pay them, right? So we'll assume in this example that this is the fixed wages that each firm that wants to hire workers, hire teachers, would want to pay to teachers. Now, where this wage rate intersects with the firm demand for labor. Now, where this straight horizontal wage line intersects with the firm's demand for labor, that will show you how much quantity of teachers would this firm want to hire. So this is cutting at this level, let's say. So we are willing to hire 30 teachers at this prevailing wage rate, right? Right? And out of 5 million, right, teachers in Pakistan, where there are hundreds and thousands of schools, where there are a couple of online teaching platforms, how many are hired at our organization? So Mega Lecture has hired 50, 60, 70. Right. So what time you have to leave, Preet? What time you have to leave? How much more time I have? Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Okay. Just let me know. So we'll close the class after like 7:45. Right? Okay. Now this is perfect label mark. Yeah, I can take the double class sometime else. Okay. Now is this clear? Preet? Absolutely clear. So this is how the graph for perfect labor market looks like, that the wages are determined on the basis of market supply and market demand, and whatever that wage rate is, right, that will intersect with the individual firm's demand curve to determine how much quantity of labor will that firm hire, right? Easy, good. Okay, now let's move on and let's discuss how is this perfect labor market different from imperfect market. How is this perfect labor market different from imperfect labor market? Okay, now think about this. Okay, now what is imperfect? Obviously, where these characteristics will not hold true, that is an imperfect labor market, right? Now, the first thing, uh, right. So that is basically the supply. So supply is perfectly elastic. That's a very good question, Preet. That's a very good question. So this wage rate is technically determining the supply, right? Because there is infinite supply at this wage rate. Do you remember that the first characteristic of the perfect labor market was that there are there is a huge supply of workers. So there are a couple of individuals, there are so many individuals who are willing to work, right, in this occupation, right? So the supply of labor in perfect labor market is perfectly elastic. So what I basically mean by that, let me also show you on a separate graph so that you can better understand. So you had wages on the y-axis, and then you had quantity of labor on the x-axis, right? So you have quantity of labor on the x-axis. Okay, now think about this. So the supply of labor is straight horizontal line. And is what it shows that at this wage rate, as long as you're providing your workers the competitive market wage, as long as you're paying your workers the competitive wage rate, which Mega Lecture we said is paying, then we can hire as many teachers as much we want to. Does this make sense, Preet? So we can hire, if we are paying our workers this wage rate, which is determined by the market forces, so it's coming from the other graph as we saw. Now at this wage rate, we can hire as many people as much we want to, 50, 60, 30. But then obviously we need to look at that how much is the demand, right? So if we have lesser students studying on Mega Lecture at the moment, then we don't need hundreds of teachers, right? But inshallah, when we grow, then we'll need hundreds of teachers. Got it? So the supply of labor for this firm is perfectly elastic, as long as we are paying the competitive wage rate, which is determined by the market force of demand and supply. Is this making sense, right? Read. Got it? Okay, now moving forward and discussing about the imperfect labor market. So imperfect labor market is where, right, just a second, where are limited employers, and I'll give you some examples of this as well, where there are limited employers and limited workers to work, right? So we are thinking of an imperfect labor market that where there are limited employers or limited companies that are willing to hire people, and or it could also be that there are limited workers who are available to work. That's the first characteristic, right? Then workers do not have homogeneous skills. Workers do not have homogeneous skill set, right? This means what I was telling you, that some workers can have, some workers can be very qualified, very trained, and on the other hand, some workers might not be that much qualified or trained, right? Then firms can have bargaining uh, bargaining power against the other group. Right. So we'll discuss that later. Forget about it. Okay. Now, what this third characteristic means, let's discuss this. Firms or workers can have disproportionate bargaining power, which means more, right? More or less, right? So disproportionate means when the bargaining power is not equal, right? It's different. One group has more, the other group has less, and vice versa, right? So firms or workers can have disproportionate bargaining power against the other group. So think about this. One simple scenario that you can think of right now is trade union. So presence of trade union gives workers more bargaining power because of the fact that, you know, it's a lobby, it's a pressure group. And if you do not, we'll talk about, by the way, in more detail after this, right? So if the company doesn't accept the demands of trade union, right, what will that organization do? What will that platform do? So trade union will go on a strike where all workers have gone on a strike because their demand for wages were not accepted, and that will obviously put pressure on the company to accept their demands, right? And things like that. But sometimes it's also the other way around. How is that the other way around? That firms have more bargaining power. So for some reasons, firms have more bargaining power, which means that they can afford to pay, and we'll also talk about that case as well, that they will pay workers less than what they should pay, right? Okay, then there would be information asymmetry. Are you following all of this? There could be information asymmetry, right? As I said, some groups can have more information, groups can have more information. Easy, we got on this? Okay, then workers are not very geographically and occupationally mobile. And right? And then there's another thing, which is there are external factors influencing, right? We got on this? Okay. Now think about this. So basically all the characteristics that I've written in front of you for the imperfect labor market, if you see, those are contradictory to what we discussed earlier for the perfect labor market, because that's what it means, that the two things are opposite to each other, right? So in imperfect labor markets, there are limited employers or limited number of workers. So there is not infinite supply, right? So that is what we discussed, that the supply of workers in the case of perfect labor market was infinite, the question that you asked me, right? So the supply curve looked like a straight horizontal line, right? Now, and this is not the case in imperfect labor market, right? That's the first thing. Then workers do not have homogeneous skill set. Some people are very qualified, trained, other people are not very qualified or trained. Firms or workers have disproportionate bargaining power against the other groups, right? So sometimes workers will have more bargaining power because of trade unions, and sometimes firms will have more bargaining power because of firms being in limited supply in a certain area, right? Then there could be information asymmetry. One group has more information compared to the other group, and workers are not very geographically and occupationally mobile because, I mean, there could be different reasons, but let's say some places, obviously, and that is very true in every case, some places in Pakistan or some cities in Pakistan are more livable compared to other cities. So people have preference of working in those bigger cities, right? They have better education, they have better healthcare, right? So people think around that. Similarly, same goes for India. Same goes for even countries like USA, right? So even in USA, not all areas or all regions are equally developed, right? So some people would prefer living in better cities, more developed, advanced, whatever you want to call it, right? And definitely the last of all is that there could be external factor influencing wages, right? Like trade unions and things like that. Okay. Now, there is like, let's move forward and talk about this, that what happened, right? So I'll just try to wrap this up. Now, within imperfect labor market, we'll talk about how trade unions operate, right? That's, we need trade unions operate. Then there's another thing within imperfect labor market that we need to discuss, and that is monopsony. Have you ever heard the word of monopsony before? Right. Then we'll talk about the government intervention. No. Okay, let me tell you. So monopsony is basically just like you had monopoly. Monopoly was a single producer of a product, or single manufacturer or producer or supplier, whatever you want to call it. Monopoly was a single producer of a product. Monopsony is, right, monopsony, there's no as such graph for imperfect labor market. There are few, but I mean, there's not one. So there will be different graphs for trade union, there will be different graph for monopsony, and there will be a different graph for government intervention. Like not one graph, just like perfect competition, sorry, perfect labor market, which could explain all. Okay. Now, just like there's a single producer in the product market, single producer in product market is known as monopoly. Monopsony is when there's a single firm in a region that is willing to hire, or in a certain sector sometimes, right? When there's a single employer in the entire market, there's only one company that is willing to hire a certain type of people. Now, let me give you an example, and that would make more sense. Think about this. So I'm sure, like, think about Pakistan, right? So there is a nuclear commission, or a nuclear, I don't even know the name, right? So there is a nuclear energy producing, or nuclear missiles producing, whatever it is, right? Department in Pakistan. Now, there is no other employer that would want to hire nuclear scientists. Are you getting me? Right? Because it's useless, right? No other company or organization would want to hire a person who has studied nuclear physics, blah, 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 right? So that is a monopsony. That's a monopsony, right? Make sense? So similarly, another example of that could be Pakistan Railway. So Pakistan Railway is one company, only one organization, one entity that hires railway related employees, right? So let's say railway drivers, there might be a separate name for it, don't know, right? So are you getting me? So that one employer, one company that is willing to hire a certain type of people, that is what a monopsony is. There's a single firm, company, right? So that is what a monopsony is, right? So what is monopsony? Monopsony is when in a labor market there is a single firm or a company that wants to hire a certain type of labor, right? Right. Yeah, we can. Perfect. Yeah. So I was about to say the same. So let's stop here from